And now we will have testimony from Secretary Benson, who is joining us on Zoom. Welcome,
Hi,
Secretary
everyone.
Benson.
Thank you, Chair Cerniglu, and hi, everybody. It's wonderful to see all of you and be able to join you today, especially to talk about this important issue, which has been a center point for a lot of us for a number of years. Both House Bill 4129 and House Bill 4130 seek to protect the people who protect our democracy, the people who, like Mary Clark and so many others, administer and stand guard over our elections. I want to thank Representative Hope for safeguarding our democracy through this legislation and her work throughout the years, and all the sponsors of this legislation. As you all know, the last 3 statewide elections have brought substantial challenges to our system and also great opportunities. In 2018, as you know, Michigan voters approved a ballot proposal significantly expanding absentee voting in our state and also establishing automatic voter registration, election day registration. And then in 2020, there was both a great influx of pro-democracy changes in our state, leading to the highest turnout election in our state's history. But our state was also the target of lies, false information about the security and accuracy of our elections that you all in Lansing and in your districts have heard and know too well. We see people being fed misinformation about our elections process simply because they don't like how the people of Michigan have voted in a particular election. And that erodes and seeks to erode the public's confidence in what was actually the most secure, accessible, and transparent election in our state's history. And since then, we have seen consistently both our clerks administering high turnout elections and Michigan citizens continuing to participate in record numbers on both sides of the aisle and continuing to vote to expand our rights under the state constitution. And we know in 2024, we're going to see both even more changes, opportunities, and challenges, because 2024 will be the first set of statewide elections where, because citizens voted for it, we will have at least 9 days of early voting in every jurisdiction in this state. We will have expanded access to drop boxes, secure receptacles for citizens to return their ballots or request ballots, and also the opportunity for citizens to permanently request to receive their ballot before an election so that they can vote either in person early or through a drop box or through the mail. So as all of these changes have hit our state, alongside the influx of lies and misinformation, which in my view is the lies and the misinformation are the greatest threat to election security today, we've seen Michigan clerks be on the front lines of all this. They have stood guard over our democracy. They have worked to educate voters throughout our state and in their districts and their jurisdictions about these changes. They have answered questions, even questions that have been duplicitous and fed through misinformation, always ensuring that our North Star of protecting every voter and every vote is real for everyone in this state. And it's been an inspiration. These clerks do this because not just it's their job, but it's their calling. They are professional, they are nonpartisan, and they are deeply committed to their responsibility to carry out free and fair elections in this state. They are Republicans, they are Democrats, they are independents, but above all, they are committed to the basic principles of what our democracy is for. And since 2020, as they have risen in prominence, our clerks and election administrators, not just in the state, but around the country, the threats and harassment that stem from the lies and misinformation that politicians and others are spreading to further their own partisan goals have really harmed their ability to simply do their jobs in a way that is unsustainable and unacceptable. And there's something that you all can do about this. As I've shared many times, I've experienced a lot of these threats firsthand, most notoriously in December 2020, when dozens of people gathered outside my home to try to pressure me into not allowing the results of a fair election to stand, pressuring me and challenging me and threatening me if I didn't nullify the votes of millions of Michigan citizens. And that was not the first time nor the last time someone had either come to my home or threatened me or threatened my staff. And I know, as much as I receive it, that the Detroit City Clerk in the city where I live and clerks all across our state are receiving the same type of unacceptable challenges for simply doing our jobs. And knowing that our clerks, our local election officials have been challenged by these threats that come in the form not just of harassment, not just form of threats through phone calls and voicemails and emails and text messages. There are times where I've put my kid to bed at night and then listened to a text message or a voicemail on my phone saying that someone can't wait to see me hanging by a tree. It is all too horrific to hear these things, and for simply doing our jobs, whether we be Republicans, Democrats, or nonpartisan, whether we be statewide or working in small towns or rural counties, whether we have more prominence or whether we are simply just trying to get along our daily lives, it's imperative that the state of Michigan protects these civil servants who are simply trying to operate our elections in a transparent and accessible way. Our election officials, all 1,500 local clerks and the 83 county clerks who serve, are neighbors. They're our community members, and they are civil servants who drive themselves to public meetings, who go back and forth from their offices to their homes, often dropping off and picking up children from school and stopping for groceries along the way every while, every minute, particularly in a contentious presidential election cycle, have to go about these daily activities that many of us take for granted while under threats or duress or looking over their shoulder or wondering if someone's going to show up and start spouting lies and untruths, armed or perhaps worse. And so knowing that these are the pressures that these election officials, who we all have a responsibility to protect, just as they protect the votes of every citizen in this state, there's more we can do to ensure that going into this 2024 election cycle, we're prepared and we have their backs. Just to emphasize that this is really a challenge in Michigan, but also in many other states. Last October, the FBI reported that Michigan was one of 7 states that experienced unusually high number of threats to election workers. Unsurprisingly, the other states were states like Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, states where the 2020 presidential election results were similarly subject to a multifaceted, coordinated misinformation campaign that we also experienced here in our state. That misinformation has led to real-world consequences that I've talked about, including death threats against local election officials in our state, and have led a lot of election officials, including 1 in 3, to leave their jobs and leave their positions. In Michigan, we've seen more than anything our clerks step up in the face of these challenges, in the face of these increased threats that they and others have experienced, and say, we're still going to do our jobs and we're going to do it with pride. And that's why it's so important for us to do the same, to match that dogged determination that our clerks have demonstrated over the years and have their backs. And this legislation helps us all do that. These bills before the committee today will ensure real accountability for anyone who harasses an election clerk to the point where that clerk feels that their safety is threatened. And these bills send a message to anyone who would attack or threaten the guardians of our democracy here in Michigan that they will not succeed, either in deterring us from doing our jobs, and they will see consequences for trying to interfere with that work. The last thing I'll just say is, in my time in office since 2019, it's been a great honor to work side by side with clerks all across our state. It's a job where, regardless of our political party affiliation or personal beliefs, we are all locked arms, committed to just ensuring that every Michigan voter, no matter where they live or who they vote for, can have faith that when they vote, their vote will be counted, their voice will be heard, and that they can trust the results of our elections to be an accurate reflection of the will of the people. The commitment that all of us share in that regard has never wavered, and it's not going to waver now as we approach 2024. But you can also demonstrate with us that you will not waver either, and you will stand to ensure our local election officials have these additional protections going into this election cycle. So thank you. Thank you again, Representative Hope and others, for bringing forth this legislation. And thank you again, Chair Cernoglu, for having me here today.
Thank you, Secretary Benson. Do we have questions? Representative Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here via remote, Secretary of State Benson. I'm just curious, as a former clerk myself, I certainly don't think that there is any tolerance or room for any sort of harassment, intimidation, and being a clerk during some of the most recent, most contentious elections that we had as well. I received some harassment myself, so I agree with that. I'm just curious, a couple of things I'm wondering, does the state have a system where we have reports or keep track of how many threats, harassment issues have been reported in the most recent elections?
It's a great question. I think it's certainly something that the Attorney General's office would be positioned to do. It requires clerks to report threats, and they report threats as instructed to law enforcement. And that's where that would be the proper vehicle for collecting that data, just as law enforcement collects data of other types of threats and crimes. So I think that's a great idea to ensure the Attorney General has the support, funds, and whatever other directives are needed to collect that data. And then give clerks an opportunity to report through that system to provide that quantitative assessment. Certainly from a qualitative standpoint, as you know, the stories are abundant and have been provided not just to this committee, but to national committees as well, both in Congress and the U.S. Senate, from clerks around our state who continue to tell their story. And also, recognize that in telling their story and in reporting those things in publicly, that it brings, I know for me, a sort of trepidation, both to have to relive the challenges or the trauma of that particular threat, but also to have that fear that by saying this, by sharing an anecdote, is it going to lead to a copycat or, inspire, for lack of better word, someone else to repeat that incident, perhaps on a greater scale. So I know that's also real as well when it comes to reporting and those challenges, as it often is for many other instances. But that said, I think it would be great for law enforcement to provide those reports in a public way and to collate them and to work with the Attorney General's office in doing so.
Okay, and just as a quick follow-up, so we don't really have that in place right now. Like, I'm just curious, like the amount of stats or reports that have been filed, and then, I just want to make sure we're coming up with a solution for this, not just putting more laws on the books and nothing really being done about them.
Yeah, I think laws on the books are a key way to providing accountability. And that's certainly why we see so many states right now, and I hope Michigan as well, strengthening the protections for our clerks. And then, of course, ensuring law enforcement is fully equipped to carry out those laws. And there have been a lot of studies, two of which I mentioned in my remarks, that have gathered through surveys, stories, anecdotes, and data about the threats election officials are experiencing. So we can continue to share those with you as well. But I agree, it would be great to have something built into the books to also ensure we're consistently collecting this. That said, in April of 2023, there was a national survey by the Brennan Center that said nearly 3/4 or 73% of local election officials have seen threats increase in recent years. 1 in 3, as I mentioned, have experienced threats, harassment, or abuse. More than half were threatened in person. And 47% of those surveyed asked their state governments to do more to support them in their jobs through passing legislation like this. And so this is, to me, a win-win for everyone, and something that would give us more tools in the toolbox to ensure we're protecting our clerks going into this election cycle.
Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Benson. And Representative Smith, I don't want to give any incorrect information, but I remember testifying on another bill earlier in the year where I believe I provided those same statistics as the Secretary. And I believe there might also be some additional stats from the FBI that was tracking harassment of election workers. And it was really just an exponential increase and, a lot of reported cases. But I'm not sure how they relate exactly to Michigan, but happy to, follow up with that detailed information. Sure. Do we have any other questions for Secretary Benson? Representative Churches.
Thank you. And I just kind of want to build off of that. Being a public official, there's been a couple of times where I myself have had to file certain things with the police, and I don't file every time because sometimes I'm embarrassed, sometimes I'm afraid, sometimes I don't want to make too much of a big deal. Could you, and I think of it from a teacher standpoint, when a kid raises their hand, there might be one question, but usually that one question, there are several other students in the room that have the same question that are too afraid to answer or to raise their hand. would it be a safe assumption to say, out of the threats that have been received and expressed, there is a possibility that there could be even more that aren't shared because of shame, embarrassment, or fear?
Yes, Representative, I would agree with that, and I would emphasize and sort of take a step back and add that the reason there are these statistics out there now is because the National Justice Department has created a task force for threats to election workers, which, among other things, seeks to collect the data and has found that there's a concentration of these threats in the states that I mentioned, in Michigan, in Nevada, in Arizona, in Georgia, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania. And you see, Nevada, for example, earlier this year passed similar legislation to this one in response to that data, in response to those threats. What we've also seen as a result of the creation of this task force is just how hard, as Representative Churches was pointing out, it is to collect holistically and comprehensively all of that data, which is part and parcel with, and sort of our responsibility with to say as a state government, this is wrong, this needs to be reported, and this is how, which is part of what we need to build here and what this legislation will frankly help us do by drawing a line in the sand between what is acceptable and what is not, and what the consequences should be, that I think would generate more reporting and collection of that data, which can help us prepare for the future. There's also a deterrent effect. We do a lot of work in advance of every election to try to deter the potential threats that could emerge on election day in partnership with law enforcement. That also comes into play here. But what we've seen is the FBI and the DOJ have worked together to create this election task force, the election threats task force, is how important it is to also build that muscle, for lack of better words, among our local election officials to report those challenges, because so many of the election officials that I've talked to, and Mary and others I think would reinforce this, we're just trying to keep our heads down and do our jobs. We don't necessarily want to be calling and reporting these incidents and all of that. And that's why it's so important that we act in a way that says, let's make sure we know, because it's not acceptable. And then when you report it, we'll hold folks accountable, because then Rep. Churches, as you might have been also alluding to, there are times in which people do report crimes or report an incident and nothing happens, which then reinforces this feeling of, well, why should I report it again when it happens again? So all of that and a lot of that can begin to be solved by this legislation today, so that we can wrap our arms around this community and ensure, again, they know we have their backs, and that we are making a clear statement that this is unacceptable, that there needs to be clear consequences, and the consequences need to be heightened to reflect the impact that these actions are having, not just on our clerks, but on democracy writ large.
Thank you, Secretary Benson, for your leadership on this and making election places a place where we have high standards for our public, and so they feel safe and supported.
Thanks.
Seeing no other questions, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you all.